Hey everybody, Jared here from Guns and Gadgets, and today we have a massive proposed rule change out of the ATF and the Department of Justice that a whole lot of NFA owners have been waiting years to hear about. Not a rumor, it's not internet speculation, it's an actual proposed federal rule published in the Federal Register that would dramatically change how Americans transport certain NFA firearms across state lines. Yes. Maybe. Look, all the rules, they're unconstitutional. I get it. We're on the same page. Just want to break down these rules for you so that you know what they are and how to support them or not support them should you choose. Honestly, if this goes through, it's one of the biggest deregulatory moves that we've seen from ATF in a long time, specifically surrounding NFA firearms. Again, unconstitutional NFA. We're talking about short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, machine guns, and destructive devices. Under the current system, if you want to take one of these items across state lines, even legally, you generally have to ask the federal government for permission first using the ATF form 5320.20. And if you don't wait for the approval, because it should take a long time to get it, you can end up in serious legal jeopardy. But now the ATF is proposing to eliminate much of that requirement for lawful travel. And what is unlawful travel? I don't know. Because our rights are our rights. And when you actually read this document, and yes, I read the whole thing, you'll notice something very important. ATF itself is openly admitting that the current system has become what they call an unnecessary regulatory hurdle. I think that's huge, because for years, gun owners have been saying the exact same thing. So today I'm going to break down exactly what this proposal does, what it means for NFA owners, what it does not change, and why this matters far beyond just travel paperwork. And as always, we're going to do it from the perspective of the Constitution and the Second Amendment, not from the perspective of bureaucrats who think your rights are privileges. So subscribe to the channel if that's what you're into. Now let's get into it. Right now, under existing federal law, if you own certain NFA-regulated firearms and you want to cross a state line with them, you generally have to submit that form 5320.20 and then wait for the approval before you transport the item. That applies to machine guns, short-barreled rifles, short-barrel shotguns, and destructive devices. And according to this proposal, ATF says the current approval process exists for three main reasons. First, to satisfy the legal requirement in 18 U.S.C. 922A4 that the Attorney General authorized interstate transportation. We don't need any Attorney General's approval or authorization to travel in our country. But this is what it says. Second, is to verify the firearm is registered with the National Firearms Registration and Transfer Record. And third, to verify that the firearm is legal in the destination state. And here's where things get interesting. The ATF openly acknowledges in this proposal that none of these reasons actually require individualized approvals for every single trip. In fact, the document cites Supreme Court precedent saying the Attorney General can authorize things categorically through rulemaking instead of forcing case-by-case approvals. Again, rulemaking is unconstitutional. And that is absolutely massive for them to admit this, I think. And it's taken them however many years they've been a thing. 91 years for the NFA. Because for decades, the federal government has operated under the assumption that Americans needed advance permission from Washington to take a lawfully owned firearm across a state line, a fake-ass line on a map. Now, I live literally 20 minutes in either direction. I can be in 3 other states. So I would need an approval to go anywhere if I go 20 minutes north, east, or south. Now, the ATF is essentially saying, actually, we probably didn't need to do all that. And it gets even better. ATF admits that from January 2020 through May of 2025, they processed almost 97,000 transport requests. And only about half of 1%, were denied because the firearm was illegal in the destination state. Think about that. Overwhelmingly, Americans transporting these firearms were already complying with the law. And what was the most common reason for denial? Not criminal activity, not a prohibited person, not dangerous intent, paperwork mistakes. And that right there perfectly summarizes the modern administrative state. Law-abiding Americans getting jammed up over technical paperwork issues while exercising a constitutional right. The proposal even admits that ATF processing delays created problems for people trying to travel lawfully. Now, here's the biggest change. Under the proposed rule, individuals transporting these NFA firearms for short-term purposes, defined as 365 days or fewer, would no longer have to submit a request to the ATF or wait for approval before crossing state lines. So if you're not going to be somewhere for a year, like if you're going to wherever for a class, or you're traveling like today, I'm going to go into Virginia, or yesterday I was in North Carolina. I mean, that's enormous that you don't have to beg for approval to bring your lawfully owned, constitutionally protected item through another part of the country that the Constitution exists in. And if finalized, lawful owners would essentially be pre-authorized to transport their firearms interstate so long as the firearm is properly registered. Again, then we're talking NFA items, right? Again, it's unconstitutional, but properly registered. The destination state allows possession. There are some communist states that don't like things like short barrel rifles or shotguns, or even suppressors. The transportation is for a lawful purpose, and the owner carries proof of their registration, meaning you have your tax stamp with you. Or that's a good question. I know DOJ watches. I know Harmony Dillon's office watched this, and the ATF offices watch this. Do you want us to actually carry the paper stamp or the ones you send to us on our phone if we save that? Is that good enough? And if somebody knows the answer, let us know. But the official answer. But yeah, and that means no more waiting for ATF approval for common situations like going to a training class or traveling for a shooting competition or visiting another residence, going hunting, taking your SBR to another state range trip, or just because you want to travel and you want to protect yourself. And let's be honest here. This should have always been the standard. The Second Amendment does not say shall not be infringed unless you cross a fake-ass dotted line on a map. The idea that Americans needed federal permission slips to temporarily travel with a lawfully owned firearm was absolutely absurd. Now, more importantly, this proposal does not eliminate all restrictions. If you are moving long-term or permanently, meaning 365 days, more than 365 actually, you still have to notify ATF at least 14 days before you move. But here's the difference. You would no longer have to wait for approval, and that's big. Under this proposal, the notice itself acts as authorization unless ATF later rescinds it, like, you can't move. Okay. So instead of begging for permission and waiting indefinitely, you notify the government and you move forward unless they specifically object. Tell me I can't move. I'm still moving with all the things I own lawfully. I don't care. Just don't care. Now, that is a fundamentally different framework. And philosophically, I think that matters too, because rights are supposed to work that way. I mean, the government should have to justify stopping us from doing anything, not the other way around. Now, another very important section is in this proposal. It involves pass-through transportation. And this is a major issue for all gun owners. Under the proposal, ATF specifically says individuals may pass through states where the firearm would otherwise be prohibited, so long as they comply with the federal safe passage protections under 18 U.S.C. 926 alpha. Remember, I'll pin it again. I did that video about ATF basically strengthening the Firearms Owners Protection Act, or telling states you shall oblige by this. We'll see if that happens. But this is what they're talking about. And it's important because we all know there are anti-gun states that aggressively target travelers. New York, New Jersey, Illinois, Massachusetts, California, and the list goes on and on. Places where lawful gun owners have historically been arrested simply for traveling through that state with a firearm. Now, before anybody misunderstands this, does not magically override hostile state governments trying to ignore federal protections. There's going to be them. They're going to try to make an example of somebody. But it does strengthen the federal regulatory acknowledgement that interstate transport protections exist. And frankly, it's refreshing to see ATF admit that lawful interstate travel with firearms should actually be protected instead of treated like suspicious behavior. The proposal also requires anyone using a common carrier to provide proof of NFA registration to the carrier, which is different because the NFA rules, the law itself, like there's only two people that can demand to see a tax stamp, and it's law enforcement and ATF personnel. So now they're saying that you have to provide that proof to a common carrier if you're going to use a common carrier. So if you're shipping or transporting through a contracted carrier, that requirement remains. So let's talk about what this proposal does not change. Foreign travel. Obviously, if you're temporarily exporting NFA firearms outside the US, the old approval process still stays in place for the FFLs and the manufacturers who are watching this video. The ATF says that's because foreign countries often prohibit these firearms and because export laws are, more complicated. So international travel remains heavily regulated, but domestically, ATF is clearly moving toward acknowledging that lawful interstate transportation should not require excessive bureaucratic intervention. Now, one section on this that really jumped out to me was the economic analysis. The ATF estimates the proposed rule would save Americans over $122,000 annually in compliance cost and about $1.23 million over 10 years. And that's only the measurable paperwork burden. That doesn't account for delayed travel, missed events, legal confusion, anxiety over approvals, administrative uncertainty. Like, all those are real burdens that they don't even talk about here. But honestly, this proposal exposes something bigger, I think. For years, Americans were told that every one of these rules were absolutely necessary for public safety. But now ATF itself admits the system provided little utility and did little to alleviate risks to public safety. That's their words, not mine. The agency itself is admitting that the burdens imposed on Americans were not meaningfully improving public safety. It didn't help public safety. And that's devastating when it comes to broader gun control narratives, because if this logic applies here, then how many other federal firearms regulations exist mainly to create bureaucratic friction for lawful gun owners? I would say all of them. How many hoops exist simply because government agencies get used to controlling Americans' behavior through administrative process? Everything administrative for ATF, everything is done that way. And this is why the founders feared centralized power, y'all. This is why the Constitution exists. Because once government acquires authority, it almost never voluntarily gives it back. Yet here we are witnessing something unusual. A federal agency actually proposing to reduce some restrictions. And of all agencies, the ATF. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suddenly pretending the ATF is the hero here, because they're not. This is still the same agency that pushed unconstitutional brace rules, still the same agency that weaponized vague definitions, still the same agency that has spent years expanding regulatory control over firearms owners. But I've always been upstanding on this channel. Credit where credit is due. I'll burn you when you need to be burned, and I'll give you credit when credit is due. This proposal moves us in the correct direction. Not where we want to be ultimately, it's a good step in the right direction. And it likely reflects on the broader constitutional pressure building after Bruin. Because after Bruin, agencies and courts are increasingly being forced to confront a real difficult reality for them. You cannot endlessly burden constitutional rights through administrative procedures and expect that system to survive constitutional scrutiny forever. Especially when the government itself admits the burden provides minimal public safety value. Now, another critical point. This is only a proposed rule. It's not final yet. There's a 90-day public comment period. It's already started. This was published on the 8th. I'll have a link down below. Go make a comment. If you're for this rule, make a comment. If you're against this rule, make a comment. The anti-gunners are going to make comments. The pro-Second Amendment folks need to do it as well. If you care about this issue, you should absolutely participate in the process. Now, of course, the other side is going to say that this is dangerous. They're going to claim that this threatens public safety. They're going to claim that interstate travel flexibility somehow creates chaos, the wild, wild west. Even though ATF's own statistics show otherwise. So remember that this proposal does not legalize prohibited possession at all. It does not eliminate NFA registration or override state bans. It doesn't even allow prohibited persons to possess firearms. It's just looking to get rid of that bureaucratic BS red tape. Because every inch of restored liberty matters. Every reduction in unnecessary federal control matters. Every acknowledgement that Americans do not need permission for ordinary lawful conduct matters. And from a constitutional perspective, this should only be the beginning. But the bigger question, guys, still remains. Why should Americans need federal registration or approval schemes for constitutionally protected arms in the first place? That's the real debate. And I think the courts are going to continue forcing that conversation over the next couple of years. But we'll see what happens. Let me know down below what you think about this. Appreciate your time. Stay armed, stay safe, and stay free. Links down below for the rule, and it's in the pinned comment as well. Do you think this goes far enough? Or do you think ATF is finally feeling the constitutional pressure after Bruin? Let me know. Take care.